On the morning of January 4, 1945, a Grumman F-6F Hellcat streaked low over the Formosan coastline. The engine sputtered, oil pressure dropping, temperature climbing. Lieutenant Charles August, leading the 2nd Division of fighters from VF-44, knew what was coming. Below him stretched Kobe Airfield, enemy territory, rows of Japanese aircraft parked like sitting ducks. His mission had been to strafe them. Now he was about to become their prize. The Hellcat hit hard, belly down on the packed earth near the airfield. Metal screamed, dust erupted. When the world stopped spinning, August climbed from the cockpit and ran. He didn't make it far. Within hours, he was a prisoner, shipped north to a camp near Tokyo. But his aircraft, Bureau No. 71441, remained behind, largely intact. A gift the Japanese naval technical staff could hardly believe. They transported it carefully to Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, the heart of Japan's aviation, its research program. There, in workshops that once hummed with confidence, engineers and test pilots gathered around this blue beast marked with white stars. They painted over the American insignia with red circles. They stenciled new numbers on the tail, Yo-801. And then they began to examine what they had captured. What they discovered would confirm a truth they had been trying desperately to deny. The war, by every measure that mattered, was already lost. Not because of strategy or tactics or the spirit of warriors, but because of something far more fundamental. The Americans had built an airplane that Japanese weapons simply could not kill. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By early 1945, the Pacific War had become a grinding exercise in attrition. Japan's carrier fleet lay shattered at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Her industrial cities burned under waves of B-29 raids. Fuel reserves had dwindled to nothing. Experienced pilots, the men who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 42, were gone. Dead over Midway, over the Solomons, over the Marianas, replaced by boys with 40 hours of flight time, sent up to die in machines that could no longer compete. The Zero, the aircraft that had once struck fear into Allied hearts, had become a liability. Mitsubishi's A6M was a brilliant design for a specific kind of war. Light, maneuverable, long-ranged. In 1941, when it faced obsolete Brewster Buffalos and early-model Wildcats, the Zero dominated. Japanese pilots racked up kill ratios that seemed almost impossible. 6-1, 8-1. They owned the sky. But the Zero's brilliance came with a cost that Japanese designers understood from the beginning. To achieve its range and agility, they stripped away everything that didn't directly contribute to flight performance. Armor plating? Too heavy. Self-sealing fuel tanks? Added weight. Robust structure. Unnecessary mass. The Zero was an aircraft designed around the philosophy that the best defense was not being hit at all. And for a while, that philosophy worked. In the hands of experienced pilots, the Zero could dodge and weave through enemy fire. Its incredible turn radius meant it could loop inside any Allied fighter's turn circle. American pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros at low speed died. The reports from Pearl Harbor, from the Philippines, from the Dutch East Indies, all told the same story. The Zero was untouchable. But by 1943, something had shifted. The Americans introduced a new generation of fighters, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning. These weren't attempts to outmaneuver the Zero. They were designed around a different philosophy entirely. Don't try to turn with the Zero. Don't try to match its climb rate at low altitude. Instead, hit it hard, hit it fast, and survive the hits you take in return. The Hellcat, in particular, embodied this philosophy. It was not elegant. It was not light. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, it weighed nearly 15,000 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the Zero's weight. It looked like what it was, a flying tank built around a 2,000 horsepower radial engine. Roy Grumman, the the company's founder and himself a naval aviator, had specified one absolute requirement. The last thing to fail on a Hellcat should be the cockpit. He and his engineers wrapped the pilot in 212 pounds of armor plate. They installed bullet-resistant glass in the windscreen. They added armor around the oil tank and oil cooler. They fitted self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits and keep flying. Every decision traded elegance for survivability. The armament was equally brutal. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. 2,400 rounds total. Each 50-caliber round packed enough kinetic energy to punch through light armor. In a 2-second burst, a Hellcat could put over 100 rounds into a target area. Against the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks and lightweight structure, it was devastating. American tactics evolved to match the hardware. No more dogfighting. Instead, the thatch weave and boom and zoom attacks. Hellcats fought in pairs, covering each other. They used their superior speed and dive performance to attack from altitude, make one high-speed pass, and climb away before the Zero could respond. If a Zero tried to follow them up, the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude meant it could simply outclimb its pursuer. The numbers told the story. By mid-1944, Hellcat squadrons were achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. 15-1, 19-1. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American Hellcats shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The Americans lost 23 fighters, most of those to anti-aircraft fire, not enemy fighters. Japanese pilots knew they were outmatched. Reports filtered back to command. The new American fighters were faster. They could take incredible amounts of damage. Their armor stopped cannon fire, but in Tokyo and Yokosuka, these reports were filtered, sanitized, reinterpreted. The official narrative remained unchanged. Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantage. Superior training and warrior ethos would compensate for inferior equipment. The engineers and technicians at Yokosuka knew better. They had been studying captured American aircraft since 1942. A P-40 Warhawk recovered in Burma, a B-17 Flying Fortress pieced together from wreckage in the Philippines. Each examination revealed the same disturbing truth. American aircraft were built to a completely different standard. Heavier structure, redundant systems, armor everywhere. When they examined a captured Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bomber earlier in the war, the report noted with surprise the extremely strong construction. When they recovered a Vought F-4U Corsair, they were amazed to find fabric covering on parts of the wing, a weight-saving measure that still maintained structural integrity. The Americans had somehow achieved both strength and efficiency, but these were isolated examinations, individual aircraft. By the time Bureau No. 71441 arrived at Yokosuka in January of 1945, the staff had seen enough examples to understand this wasn't an anomaly. This was American design philosophy. Every aircraft they built carried this same obsessive attention to survivability. They rolled the Hellcat into a testing hangar, photographed it from every angle, measured dimensions, weighed components. They removed panels to examine the internal structure. What they found was simultaneously impressive and dispiriting. The fuselage was built like a bridge, heavy frames, thick longerons, redundant load paths. If one structural member failed, another could carry the load. It was the opposite of Japanese design, which minimized structure to save weight, accepting that battle damage would likely be catastrophic. The armor was even more sobering. The Japanese engineers measured and documented each piece. Behind the pilot's seat, 2 layers of steel plate, each 3/8 of an inch thick, another plate below the seat. Plates behind the instrument panel, plates around the oil tank. The massive double Wasp engine itself functioned as a shield, its 18 cylinders and thick crankcase, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and continuing to run. They examined the fuel system, self-sealing tanks, a technology Japan had never successfully implemented in production. The tanks were lined, with multiple layers of rubber and fabric that would swell when punctured by gunfire, automatically sealing holes. A zero hit in the fuel tank would erupt in flames. A Hellcat would leak fuel briefly, then seal itself, and keep fighting. The test pilots wanted to fly it, to experience firsthand what American pilots had been flying against them for nearly 2 years. They fueled it carefully, precious aviation gasoline that Japan could barely produce anymore. They ran the big radial engine, listening to its deep, powerful rumble, and then they took it up. The reports from those test flights, preserved in Japanese archives, revealed a kind of quiet despair. The Hellcat was not particularly maneuverable by Japanese standards. It could not turn with a zero, could not match the A6M's climb rate below 14,000 feet. In a low-speed, low-altitude turning fight, a competent zero pilot would win every time. But the Hellcat didn't need to fight that way. Above 14,000 feet, it climbed as well as the zero. In a dive, it was significantly faster, and its speed advantage in level flight, combined with that massive engine, meant it could dictate the terms of engagement. Attack from altitude, one high-speed pass, climb away. The zero couldn't follow, couldn't catch up, couldn't force the engagement into the turning fight where Japanese aircraft excelled. One test pilot, Lieutenant Masato Yokota, later briefed other pilots on American fighter performance. His assessment of the F-6 F-3 was clinical and devastating. Advantages: heavy armor protection, high speed, good high-altitude performance, reliable engine. Disadvantages: not particularly maneuverable, vulnerable to high-speed compression effects in extreme dives, relatively poor low-altitude combat performance. Then came the critical observation. Showing your tail is risky, Yokota warned. The Hellcat's .650 caliber machine guns were deadly accurate and had tremendous ammunition capacity. Also, as Hellcat pilots think their teamwork tactics as an insurance. Once the team is broken into 1 versus 1 fight, it is unexpectedly easy for you to fight, but you must study how to break the formation first. In other words, the Hellcat was vulnerable if you could isolate it and force it into a slow-speed turning fight. But good luck doing that. American pilots never flew alone. They never gave you the opportunity to dictate terms. And if you made a mistake, if you gave them a single clean shot, their overwhelming firepower would kill you instantly. But there was another test the Yokosuka staff needed to conduct, a test that would quantify what pilots had been reporting for months. They needed to know if Japanese weapons could actually damage this aircraft. Could the Type 99 cannon, the standard armament of every Japanese naval fighter, penetrate the Hellcat's armor? They set up a test range, mounted Hellcat armor plates at various distances, loaded Type 99 cannons, both the Mark I and the more powerful Mark II models, and they began firing. The Type 99 cannon had been Japan's pride when it entered service in 1939. Based on the Swiss Oerlikon design, it was one of the lightest 20mm aircraft cannons in the world. The Mark I model weighed just 54 pounds. The Mark II, introduced in 1942, weighed 70 pounds. By comparison, the British Hispano-Suiza cannon weighed over 100 pounds. This lightness was essential for Japanese design philosophy. The Zero could not carry heavy weapons without sacrificing the range and maneuverability that made it effective, so Japanese engineers had accepted the trade-off. The Type 99 used a blowback action with advanced primer ignition, elegant and simple, but inherently limited in power. The Mark I fired projectiles at just 600 meters per second, slow by cannon standards. Japanese pilots had complained about this almost from the beginning. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, wrote in his memoir that while he appreciated the cannon's hitting power, its ballistic performance was poor. The shells arced through the air like urine, he wrote, a crude but accurate description. At anything beyond point-blank range, hitting a maneuvering target required extraordinary skill and more than a little luck. The Mark II model, introduced to address these complaints, used a longer barrel and a cartridge with 40% more propellant. This increased muzzle velocity to 750 meters per second. Better, but still well below what German or American cannons achieved. The MG-151 fired at 850 meters per second. The American 20mm Hispano exceeded that, but velocity wasn't everything. The Type 99 fired explosive shells, high-explosive incendiary rounds that would detonate on impact, sending fragments through the target, against unarmored aircraft, against wooden structures, against fuel tanks. These shells were devastating. A single hit could ignite a fuel fire. 2 or 3 hits would tear a wing apart, and for the first 2 years of the war, that had been enough. American and British fighters in the early Pacific campaigns had minimal armor. The Brewster Buffalo had none. The early Wildcats had some protection, but not much. When a Zero's cannon shells hit them, they burned. The Type 99 had earned its reputation with blood, but now, on the firing range at Yokosuka, Japanese engineers were about to discover what American designers had known all along. Explosive shells are devastating against soft targets. Against armor plate, they're nearly useless. They set up the test carefully. Mounted sections of the Hellcat's armor at measured distances. 25 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. They wanted to know at what range the Type 99 could penetrate 3/8-inch steel plate. The same thickness that protected Hellcat pilots. They loaded the Mark I cannon first, aimed, fired. The sharp crack of the 20mm echoed across the range. The shell hit the armor plate and exploded on the surface. When they examined the plate, they found a shallow crater. Fragments had scarred the steel, but the shell had not penetrated. The plate was intact. They moved closer, 25 meters, point-blank range for air combat. Fired again, same result. The explosive shell detonated on impact with the armor face, spending its energy in fragmentation rather than penetration. The armor plate had a deeper dent, more scoring, but it held. The engineers looked at each other. This was not what they had hoped to see. They tried the Mark II cannon, more powerful, higher velocity. Surely it would perform better. They fired from 50 meters. The result was marginally better. The shell punched a slightly deeper crater, but it still did not penetrate. The Hellcat's armor had stopped it, cold. They tried armor-piercing rounds, the armor-piercing incendiary belts that Japanese fighters carried mixed with high-explosive shells. These were solid shot, designed to punch through rather than explode on the surface. The results were better, but not by much. At close range, 25 meters or less, the armor-piercing shells could occasionally penetrate 3/8-inch plate, but at combat ranges, 50 meters or more, they simply bounced off or shattered. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The Type 99 Mark II, Japan's most powerful operational aircraft cannon, fired a 90-gram projectile at 750 meters per second. That gave it a kinetic energy of roughly 25,000 joules at the muzzle, but energy bled off rapidly with distance. Air resistance slowed the shell. By 100 meters, it had lost nearly 20% of its energy. 3/8-inch steel plate, properly hardened, could resist penetration from projectiles, carrying less than 30,000 joules of energy at impact. The Type 99 Mark II was right at the threshold at point-blank range. At any realistic combat distance, it simply didn't have enough power. The engineers ran the numbers again and again, hoping they had made an error. They hadn't. The same calculations that showed the Type 99 was adequate against unarmored targets now proved it was nearly useless against American armor. Every Hellcat carried multiple layers of this armor around the cockpit. The pilot sat in a steel box that Japanese cannon fire could not reliably penetrate. They expanded the test. What about other parts of the Hellcat? Surely the armor was only around the cockpit. They examined the engine cowling. The massive double Wasp engine itself provided protection, 18 cylinders of cast steel and aluminum. Firing tests showed that cannon shells striking the engine would damage individual cylinders, but the engine would continue running. It was, designed with redundancy. Lose 2 cylinders? Keep flying. Lose 4? Still enough power to make it home. The oil system was armoured, the oil cooler protected by steel plates. Even the fuel system was resilient in ways Japanese engineers found hard to believe. They examined the self-sealing tanks closely, multiple layers of rubber compounds sandwiched between fabric. When punctured, the rubber would swell from contact with fuel, plugging the hole within seconds. They tested it, shot holes in a sample tank, watched as the leaks sealed themselves. It worked exactly as designed. One of the engineers, Lieutenant Toyoda Takago, later wrote about these examinations. The technical staff at Yokosuka numbered just over 300 people, split between the main office and a branch at Isogo. Of these, perhaps 10 officers, 10 civilian designers, and 150 enlisted men worked on analyzing foreign aircraft. They were desperately overworked, trying to keep up with their own design projects, while also studying every piece of enemy equipment they could capture. They had examined American aircraft before, B-17s, pieced together from wreckage, a P-51 Mustang captured in China. Each examination had been educational but abstract. Now, with the war clearly lost, with American bombers burning their cities and American fighters dominating the sky, the lessons from studying the Hellcat took on an immediate, personal urgency. The Japanese designers began to understand the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about one airplane. The Hellcat represented a systematic American approach to aviation that Japan could not match. The Americans had designed for survivability from the ground up. They had assumed their aircraft would be hit, would take damage, and they had engineered every system to keep flying despite that damage. Japanese philosophy had been the opposite. Don't get hit. Is likely lost. Focus all resources on speed, range, and agility. This had worked brilliantly in 1941 and 42 against inferior opposition. Against the Hellcat, it was suicide. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The test results were compiled into reports, circulated among the technical staff, some filtered up to command. But by January 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was beyond the point where technical reports mattered. The Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway in June 1942, lost another 4 at the Philippine Sea in June 1944. The few carriers still operational had no aircraft, no fuel, no trained pilots. The air groups that had terrorized the Pacific in the war's first year were gone, dead or captured, replaced by hastily trained teenagers with minimal flight hours, sent up in worn-out aircraft to face American pilots flying machines like the Hellcat. The kill ratios told the story. By late 1944, American pilots were achieving 30-to-1, 40-to-1 kill ratios in some engagements. It wasn't even a fair fight anymore. Japanese industry, strangled by submarine warfare and strategic bombing, could no longer produce aircraft in meaningful numbers. In 1944, Japan built approximately 28,000 aircraft of all types. The United States built 96,000. American factories were producing more aircraft in a single month than Japan could build in a year, and the American aircraft were better. Not just the Hellcat, but everything. The Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang. Each one was faster, more heavily armed, and far more survivable than anything Japan could field. American pilots flew them with confidence, knowing that their aircraft could take hits and keep fighting. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They were being sent up to die in aircraft that couldn't compete, armed with weapons that couldn't kill their opponents. Some refused to engage, breaking off when they spotted Hellcats. Others flew kamikaze missions, the only way they could guarantee hitting an American ship. Better to die with certainty than to be shot down helplessly in a dogfight they couldn't win. At Yokosuka, the engineers working on Bureau number 71441 eventually tried to make it airworthy again. They needed parts that Japan didn't have: American engine components, specialized instruments. They improvised where they could, but the Hellcat was a complex machine, designed for mass production in American factories with access to specialized alloys and precision manufacturing. Japanese shops, working with inferior materials and worn-out tools, couldn't replicate the parts they needed. The Hellcat made at least one more flight after its capture, probably a short test hop. Then it suffered another mechanical failure and belly landed again. This time, the Japanese didn't bother trying to repair it. They pushed it into a grass dispersal area near the hangars and left it there, a monument to their inability to match American industrial might. When American forces occupied Yokosuka Naval Air Station after Japan's surrender in August 1945, they found the Hellcat still sitting where it had been abandoned. Japanese markings crudely painted over American insignia, the tail number YO-801 barely visible beneath peeling paint. Bureau number 71441 still stenciled on the tail, a reminder of where this aircraft had come from. American sailors photographed it, a curious artifact of the war. They noted the damage, the makeshift repairs, the evidence of Japanese attempts to understand American technology. Then they pushed it aside to make room for their own aircraft. The Hellcat had served its purpose, had proven, one final time, the overwhelming superiority of American design and manufacturing. But the real story wasn't the aircraft itself. It was what the Japanese had learned from examining it. The reports from Yokosuka confirmed what frontline pilots had been desperately trying to tell command for months. Japanese weapons could not reliably kill American fighters. The Type 99 cannon, the weapon that had seemed so powerful in 1941, was inadequate, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed for a different kind of war, against a different kind of enemy. The Americans had built the Hellcat to fight a specific enemy, the Zero, and they had done it by studying every captured example they could find. The most famous was Koga Zero, recovered nearly intact from Akutan Island in the Aleutians in June of 1942. American test pilots flew it extensively, documented its strengths and weaknesses, found that above 200 knots, the Zero's ailerons froze up, making it impossible to roll quickly. Found that in a high-speed dive, American fighters could simply pull away. Those findings had influenced the Hellcat's design, not by copying the Zero, but by creating its opposite. Where the Zero was light, the Hellcat was heavy. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the Hellcat sacrificed elegance for survivability. Where the Zero relied on pilot skill to avoid being hit, the Hellcat assumed hits were inevitable and planned accordingly. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare, one that reflected the two nations' industrial and strategic positions. Japan had entered the war knowing it could not match American production capacity. Its strategy depended on winning quickly, decisively, before American industry could fully mobilize. The Zero embodied that strategy: long range to strike across vast distances, agility to dominate in individual combat, minimal armor because the war would be over before attrition became decisive. But Japan had miscalculated. The war didn't end quickly. American industry did mobilize, and once it did, the numbers became overwhelming. By 1944, the United States was producing not just more aircraft, but better aircraft, and they were producing them faster than Japan could destroy them. The Hellcat production numbers told the story. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. At peak production in 1944, Grumman's Bethpage, Long Island plant was completing 500 Hellcats per month, one every 90 minutes, around the clock. Japan couldn't shoot them down as fast as America could build them, and every one of those Hellcats carried armor that Japanese weapons couldn't penetrate. Every one was flown by a pilot who knew that if he was hit, he had a reasonable chance of surviving. American pilots shot down in combat were often rescued by submarine or seaplane, returned to duty weeks later. Japanese pilots shot down over water usually drowned. Japan had no effective search and rescue system. Lose a pilot, and you lost years of training that could never be replaced. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. In the first year of the war, Japan lost roughly 500 naval aviators killed or missing. Painful, but sustainable. By the second year, losses had climbed to 1,500. By the third year, over 3,000. By 1944, Japanese naval aviation was bleeding to death. The experienced pilots were gone. The training programs couldn't produce replacements fast enough, and the new pilots, with minimal flight hours and obsolete aircraft, were being massacred. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 illustrated the collapse perfectly. Japan launched 4 massive airstrikes against the American carrier task force, nearly 400 aircraft in total. American Hellcats, guided by radar and directed by fighter controllers, intercepted them far from the fleet. In the ensuing battle, American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft. The Americans lost 29 fighters, most to mechanical problems or fuel exhaustion, not enemy action. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots who survived called it slaughter. The few who made it back to their carriers were traumatized. They reported that the American fighters were everywhere, that they couldn't be evaded, that hitting them did nothing. Cannon shells that should have set American aircraft on fire simply sparked off armor plate. The Americans kept coming, kept shooting, until every Japanese aircraft in the sky was dead or fleeing. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement that day. He and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, encountered a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. Just 2 Hellcats against 60. They attacked anyway. In the resulting melee, McCampbell and Rushing shot down 15 aircraft between them. Not one Japanese aircraft reached the American carriers. McCampbell's Hellcat landed back aboard USS Essex with its fuel tanks bone dry and only 6 rounds of ammunition remaining. All 6 were jammed in the guns. He had fired every usable round he carried. His aircraft had multiple bullet holes in the wings and fuselage. None had penetrated anything vital. The armor had done its job. That was the reality facing Japanese pilots in the last year of the war. They were fighting an enemy they could not hurt, in aircraft that couldn't protect them, with weapons that didn't work. The Type 99 cannon, once feared and respected, had become a symbol of Japan's inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Japanese designers tried. They developed new aircraft, the Kawanishi N-1K Shiden, a powerful fighter with 4 20mm cannons and better armor protection. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, a heavily armed interceptor designed to shoot down B-29s. On paper, these aircraft were competitive with American designs. In practice, Japan couldn't build them in sufficient numbers, couldn't train pilots to fly them effectively, couldn't provide the fuel and maintenance they required. The industrial bottleneck was absolute. Japan's aircraft production peaked in 1944 and then collapsed. Factories were bombed, supply lines cut. The specialized aluminum alloys needed for aircraft construction became impossible to obtain. By 1945, Japanese factories were building aircraft with wooden components, reverting to technology from the previous war. Meanwhile, American production continued to accelerate. The Hellcat was being supplemented by the Corsair, finally debugged and carrier qualified. The Navy was introducing the F-8F Bearcat, even faster and more powerful than the Hellcat. The Army Air Forces had the P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. Each new American design incorporated lessons from combat. Each was better than the last. The engineers at Yokosuka understood all of this. They could see the trajectory, could calculate where it ended. Some tried to develop countermeasures, proposed new cannons with higher velocity, suggested adding armor to Japanese fighters, even if it meant sacrificing performance. But by 1945, these proposals were irrelevant. Japan didn't have the industrial capacity to implement them, didn't have the time. The captured Hellcat sitting on the ramp at Yokosuka became a kind of memorial, a reminder of what modern industrial warfare looked like when one side had unlimited resources and the other was starving. American sailors who saw it after the surrender understood immediately what it represented. Japanese engineers had studied this aircraft, trying to find weaknesses, trying to understand how to defeat it, and they had found nothing. The armor couldn't be penetrated by standard weapons. The structure was too strong to be easily damaged. The engine was too reliable, too powerful. The fuel system was too well protected. Every aspect of the Hellcat's design reflected American industrial might and engineering sophistication. It was a machine built by a nation that could afford to make things properly, that could test and refine and improve until every system worked exactly as intended. Japan had never had that luxury. Japanese engineers were brilliant, creative, capable of extraordinary innovation with limited resources. The Zero itself proved that. But by 1945, creativity couldn't compensate for the resource gap, couldn't overcome the fact that America had more steel, more aluminum, more fuel, more trained workers, more production capacity, more of everything. The test results from firing Type 99 cannons at Hellcat armor plates were filed away in Yokosuka's archives. After the war, American technical intelligence teams collected these documents, studied them, found them useful for understanding Japanese weapons capabilities. But the Americans already knew what the tests had proven. They had designed the Hellcat's armor specifically to resist 20mm cannon fire. The Japanese tests simply confirmed that American engineers had succeeded. For the Japanese pilots who flew against Hellcats in the war's final year, the knowledge that their weapons were inadequate offered no comfort. They went up anyway. Because orders were orders, because the alternative was to wait for American bombers to reduce Japan to ashes. Because in the culture of Bushido, surrender was not an option. Many chose kamikaze missions instead. If conventional weapons couldn't kill American ships, then use the aircraft itself as a weapon, pack it with explosives, and fly it into a carrier. At least that way death had meaning. At least that way you could guarantee results. The desperation behind that choice reflected how completely Japanese aviation had collapsed. Lieutenant Charles August, the pilot whose forced landing had given Japan Bureau No. 7-1441, survived the war. Liberated from his POW camp after Japan's surrender, he returned to the United States. He had been a prisoner twice, first after being shot down over North Africa in 1942, then again after his engine failed over Formosa. Both times he survived. His aircraft didn't always bring him home, but it kept him alive long enough to have a chance. That was what the armor was for. Not to make the Hellcat invincible, but to give pilots a fighting chance. To let them take hits and keep flying. To bring them home even when things went wrong. American pilots understood this. They trusted their aircraft, flew aggressively because they knew their machines could absorb punishment. That confidence translated directly into combat effectiveness. Japanese pilots had no such confidence. They flew aircraft they knew were vulnerable, carried weapons they knew were inadequate, faced enemies they knew they couldn't kill. The psychological burden was immense. Some broke under it, others embraced fatalism. A few, the very best, found ways to adapt, to use tactics that maximized what little advantage their aircraft still possessed. But by 1945, even the best Japanese pilots were dying in unequal combat. The story of Bureau No. 7-1441, the captured Hellcat at Yokosuka, is ultimately a story about industrial warfare and its human cost, about what happens when one nation can build machines that another nation's weapons cannot kill, about the moment when technical superiority becomes so overwhelming that courage and skill no longer matter. The Japanese engineers who examined that Hellcat understood they were looking at the future, a future where wars would be won not by the best pilots or the most innovative designs, but by whoever could produce the most of the best equipment. They had known this intellectually since Pearl Harbor. Now they saw it made manifest in 212 pounds of armor plate that their cannons could not penetrate. In the end, the Hellcat's armor didn't just protect American pilots, it protected American strategy. It allowed the Navy to fight aggressively, to take risks, to press attacks home, because pilots knew they had a reasonable chance of survival. That confidence was itself a weapon, perhaps as important as the 650 caliber machine guns or the 2,000 horsepower engine. Wars are lost in many ways. On battlefields, in conferences, in the hearts of soldiers who no longer believe victory is possible. By January 1945, when Bureau No. 71441 arrived at Yokosuka, Japan had lost in all three ways. The battlefield was collapsing, the conferences were discussing surrender terms, and the engineers examining that captured Hellcat knew with absolute certainty that their weapons could not kill it. That knowledge spread. Pilots heard rumors, engineers whispered to each other, "The Type 99 won't penetrate American armor. Save your ammunition. Look for vulnerable spots. Engine cowlings, wing roots, cockpit glass if you can hit it precisely. But the protected areas are invulnerable. The Americans have armor we cannot defeat." And so the war ground on for another 7 months. American carriers ranged freely along the Japanese coast. Hellcats strafed airfields, escorted bombers, shot down anything that rose to challenge them. Japanese pilots died, ships burned, cities were reduced to ash. Until finally, in August, 2 atomic bombs made it undeniable that resistance was futile. The engineers at Yokosuka watched American occupation forces arrive, helped inventory their own facilities, answered questions from American intelligence officers about what they had learned from studying captured aircraft. The Hellcat, Bureau No. 71441, was examined one final time, photographed, documented, then scrapped or left to rot. Its story was over. But the lesson endured. Wars in the industrial age are decided by production capacity and technological sophistication. The nation that can build the most of the best equipment and can produce it faster than it can be destroyed will eventually win. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance can overcome that fundamental arithmetic. The Hellcat embodied that truth. 212 pounds of armor, 650 caliber machine guns, 2,000 horsepower, self-sealing fuel tanks, redundant systems, every piece designed to survive and keep fighting. It wasn't the most elegant aircraft ever built, wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable, but it was effective, survivable, producible, and against an enemy armed with 20mm cannons that couldn't penetrate its armor, it was dominant. The Japanese discovered this through careful testing. Through firing their best weapons at American armor plate and watching the shells bounce off, through examining the massive engine and understanding they couldn't build anything comparable, through studying the self-sealing fuel tanks and realizing their own aircraft would never have that protection. They learned what their pilots had been trying to tell them, that the Americans had built an airplane they could not kill with the weapons they possessed, and in learning that, they understood the war was truly over. Not because of one aircraft, but because that aircraft represented a systematic approach to warfare that Japan, with its limited industrial base and dwindling resources, could never match. The captured Hellcat at Yokosuka was a teacher. It taught Japanese engineers about American industrial might, about design philosophy, about what modern warfare demanded, but most of all, it taught them that some gaps cannot be closed through ingenuity or courage alone. Some advantages are so fundamental, so overwhelming, that defeat becomes inevitable. That was the real lesson of Bureau No. 71441. Not just that its armor stopped Japanese cannon fire, though it did, but that it represented a way of making war that Japan could not compete with. And in recognizing that truth, in understanding its implications, the engineers at Yokosuka saw their future written in steel and duralumin. Or perhaps they did, and simply couldn't bring themselves to say it aloud. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.